The FIG regime obviously changes all of that and gives us much greater scope to restructure the portfolio over that 4-year window, effectively taking into consideration all the do's and don'ts that one has to take into account when managing money for clients.
With the FIG regime, there's a 4-year period where the Americans can basically rebase their assets, realise some gains, get out of a position where they've got the wrong investments basically. So they've got a period of time where they can change that, and they can remit to the UK, and there's no worry about remittance to the UK. So the FIG regime is actually probably more beneficial for most Americans.
So today we're discussing the case study of an American family moving to London in September 2026. I'm joined by my two guests, Martin Scullion from Buzzacott and Nick Wood from Sarasin. Welcome to you, gentlemen.
Hello.
Great to be here. Thank you very much.
Good to see you both. So we're going to discuss a scenario at the moment. I'm going to set it up in a second. But first of all, it'd be great to hear, Martin, first of all, how you help American clients moving to London.
I help them with tax. So basically, I'm a dual qualified US UK private client tax advisor. I also am a cross-border trust specialist, so many Americans have trusts. So yeah, I help them when they move over to the UK in terms of the tax.
Fantastic. And Nick?
Well, I'm a partner at Sarasin Partners, and we manage portfolios on behalf of clients internationally, and that includes US clients, and we have a separate SEC registered entity of which I'm a director. So we frequently see movement of clients from the US to the UK and vice versa.
So just to set up the scenario, Daniel Harrington, 42, is a senior investment banker in New York, being seconded to his bank's London office, seeking a calmer chapter after increased volatility in the US financial sector. His wife, Emily, 40, is a self-employed marketing consultant who will continue her US consultancy work from London. Their children, Sophie, 12, and Caleb, 9, will enrol in London schools starting in September 2026. The family arrives on a skilled worker visa through Daniel, with Emily as a dependent, qualifying for the new foreign income and gains FIG regime. They bring a complex US financial footprint, security portfolios with PFIC issues, traditional IRAs and 401ks, education plans, and a revocable New York trust, and Emily's 1% LLC interest in US commercial real estate. They can commit £2 million over a 4-year FIG period and want to restructure efficiently before UK taxation fully applies. Martin, just setting the tax backdrop, the Harringtons are arriving in summer 2026, just after the abolition of the remittance basis, but qualifying for the new FIG regime. For advisors who spent years on remittance basis planning, we're into a completely different world. Can you tell us a little bit about what's fundamentally different in this US scenario?
For new arrivals to the UK, it's completely changed. So basically, there's no longer the remittance basis, so there's no longer the typical planning we did with setting up segregated accounts, clean capital, income, capital gains accounts, where everything was segregated. You need to be very careful of transfers of money, transfer money to the UK, but also transfer money to each other account, because it's very easy to make it a mixed fund. Particularly for Americans, it's actually quite beneficial because Americans, they're taxed on the worldwide income in the US, so their income and gains will be taxable in the US. And so the benefit of the remittance basis was, really just the difference between the UK rates and the US rates, which was useful. But now, with the FIG regime, there's a 4-year period where the Americans can basically, they've got time to actually rebase their assets, realise some gains, get out of a position where they've got the wrong investments basically. So they've got a period of time where they can change that, and they can remit to the UK, and there's no worry about remitting to the UK. So the FIG regime is actually probably more beneficial for most Americans that come to the UK.
It's a critical window for them to do something, isn't it? Is one of the key messages, not to just wait and live and see how you get on.
The key advice is basically don't wait, get advice straight away, and plan now rather than when it's too late.
So Martin, the Harringtons have 4 years where foreign income and gains are fully exempt. There's no remittance restrictions, no clean capital accounts. Talk us through why this matters.
This really matters because the old remittance basis can be a real tax trap, particularly for Americans, because Americans are taxed on the worldwide income and gains, and then remittance basis potentially taxed when you remit. So because the remittance rules are so complex, you could get in a situation where someone remits some income or gains inadvertently in a couple of years after it was earned, taxed in the UK on that, but they've already been taxed in the US, so it's basically double taxation. You're not able to carry back foreign tax credits more than 1 year for US purposes, and therefore the remittance basis for Americans, it can be a bit of a tax trap. You get in a situation where you can't have double taxation.
And Nick, I mean, how is this impacting your role? I mean, I imagine many conversations with people like Martin on the tax side, but it's fundamentally changing the way you might construct portfolios or some of the old thinking.
Absolutely. In previous years, the remittance rules were extremely complicated, and we definitely need to have somebody like Martin in the room sort of advising the clients on the tax side. And from an investment perspective, there was a sort of mad rush about whether or not assets should be sold prior to them coming over to the UK. You certainly didn't want assets in the UK and then selling them and triggering sort of unwarranted tax liabilities. Also, the remittance rules meant that restructuring from an investment perspective was slow and cumbersome, and we were effectively tinkering already existing portfolios and not necessarily having the ability to manage their longer term investment planning and needs from the outset. The FIG regime obviously changes all of that and gives us much greater scope to restructure the portfolio over that 4-year window, effectively taking into consideration all the do's and don'ts that one has to take into account when managing money for clients.
And what kind of portfolios might they arrive with? I mean, you might have ETFs, mutual funds, a typical kind of US client coming into the UK. What are you looking at often with them?
Well, exactly right. I mean, there's an enormous amount of things that clients need to consider when they change location. You know, there's obviously tax implications, there's legal things, there's educational changes they need to make. One of the last things they probably sort of consider is the investment restrictions. And so coming into the UK, the Harrington's portfolios are probably full of US mutual funds and US listed ETFs. Terribly efficient whilst they were in the US, but a bit of a headache for two really main reasons for us as investment managers. First, their US portfolio was probably very US centric. It was probably managed in dollars, and therefore any distributions to them were likely to be in dollars as well. And their nominal assets, their low risk assets, were probably in US dollar treasuries or corporate bonds. Their shift to the UK from an investment perspective means that their currency of liability is now sterling, and so some of that asset mix is totally inappropriate. On the second hand, perhaps the bigger issue is that these US mutual funds, these US listed ETFs, etc., are probably going to be considered offshore non-reporting funds from an HMRC perspective and trigger some quite onerous tax complications for them, and should definitely be avoided. There should definitely be some restructuring the portfolio. Now, the FIG regime obviously allows us to make those changes in a more sort of timely, efficient manner, but it's definitely something that we need to be aware of.
And just on the tax side, Martin, with these offshore non-reporting funds, say if they didn't restructure in the FIG window, what are the kind of tax computations that you might be going through if as they're making disposals?
I mean, I guess for the Harringtons, they're a wealthy family. They're going to be on the 45% top rate, assuming they're in England. In Scotland, there's going to be more. So compared to the 20% long-term capital gains rate in the US, you're looking at a 25% point difference there. So that's a huge difference if they're selling non-reporting funds for capital gains purposes. It's very bad planning. Get it all sorted out during the 4-year FIG window.
Yeah.
Because in terms of the selection of investments, I mean, the offshore non-reporting fund rules gives you a bigger universe, doesn't it? So as an investment manager, there's a trade-off there, isn't there, in terms of how you select the investment?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the first thing that we would obviously want to do with a portfolio for the Harringtons, if they're coming across, is check whether these offshore funds actually do have UK reporting status. The HMRC update a regular list of those funds that do qualify under that regime. We noted earlier that the Harringtons also have some ETFs in their portfolio. Now, these are exchange-traded funds. They're very efficient collective investment vehicles to track perhaps a sector or an index for the portfolios, and they're traded on the stock exchange. Now, whilst they trade very easily and efficiently like any other US security, Microsoft, and Apple, etc., they are definitely not taxed in the same way. And so you have to make sure that those US listed ETFs also have UK reporting fund status. If they don't, then what you have to do is obviously sell them within the FIG regime, but it's certainly not as straightforward as simply selling those non-reporting funds and putting them into UK collectives like investment trusts, like UK ETFs, REITs, etc. Because, of course, from a US tax perspective, they fall foul of the PFIC regime, the Passive Foreign Investment Company tax implications. A little bit like the HMRC tax of gains as income rate, the PFICs from a US perspective are taxed in a similar way, but also carry with them quite hefty tax penalties. I'm sure Martin will sort of touch on that. Definitely not my bag at the moment, but he'll definitely touch on that. And so we definitely want to make sure that we put the portfolio into efficient, dual qualifying ETFs, etc.
And Martin, just beyond the non-reporting fund issue, what are the other inefficient investments we were just touching on there for Americans in the UK?
There's a variety of them, but yeah, I'll start on the obviously the PFIC issue. So some Americans come to the UK without PFICs, but then they accidentally get involved in PFICs because someone advised them, invest in a stocks and shares ISA, which typically has unit trusts, and so they end up with a PFIC issue. The reason why PFICs are inefficient is the income tax rates in the US with an interest charge over the holding period. So you're looking at 37% tax potentially for the Harringtons plus interest over time, which over a 10-year period might raise up to, with interest rates at the moment, might raise up to 75%, that sort of thing in 10 years' time. Plus, if it's not in the stocks and shares ISA, if it's in just a normal portfolio account, you're going to have a UK tax on that as well. So you're going to have double taxation. US will not allow foreign tax credits against a PFIC unless it's there's a small amount that they will allow. But so yeah, you're potentially looking over 100% tax. It's ridiculous. So avoid PFICs at all costs. They shouldn't get involved in ISAs. Maybe potentially interest-only cash ISAs are fairly acceptable, but avoid PFICs at all costs.
What about pensions? I mean, what are some of the structures if they are going to be here for a bit longer? What sort of things do you think work and actually help?
Pensions are all right.
Yeah.
I've got no problem with pensions. I mean, there's potentially some reporting requirements because you've got your annual reports of all your foreign financial assets and stuff like that. And potentially, if it's a trust-based pension, you've got some reporting requirements. But the tax treaty between the US and UK allows tax-free growth of pensions. So there's no issue there until you take it out. And at that point, I mean, the Harringtons are not at that stage where they're taking the pensions out. They might want a bit of advice about how they can withdraw tax efficiently. But the growth shouldn't be an issue. There's other investments. I mean, so we looked at Emily's got an LLC interest. LLCs are transparent for US purposes, but for UK purposes, they're corporate opaque entities. So there's a complete tax mismatch there. The US will tax you on your share of the profits of the LLC, so the rental income or whatever it is the LLC has got, whereas the UK will say, well, wait till you've actually had an extraction of the profit and we'll tax you with a dividend. So, and there's basically double taxation. So during the FIG window, we look at LLC investments and suggest, do you want to keep it or what is the cost benefit of having it or getting rid of it?
Because what's the implications? You mentioned on the top the warning of not doing something in the FIG regime. So say if the do nothing position, they get to year 5, they've got these kind of assets in play. What's the implication for them?
The planning gets more complicated because you kind of need to sort of talk to them about, well, you can't get rid of it and not face some sort of UK sort of liability on the withdrawal of the profits. It's either going to be a dividend or it's going to be a capital gain on the sale of your interest. Possibly a capital gain might work because if you're selling an interest in an LLC, realising a gain, the US and UK might match up. But that's getting rid of your entire investment. And Emily's got 1% interest in the LLC. She doesn't have much choice in terms of whether she can withdraw, make distributions to herself or refuse distributions. She doesn't have any control. And these investments sometimes are not very liquid. You can't just sell it. She's not in a position where she's got any control over the business. So planning after the FIG regime becomes very difficult.
And Nick, for you, in your role in reconstructing the portfolio, talk to us a little bit about the practicalities of looking at the portfolio and what it's going to look like when it's more tax efficient. You know, you've got all sorts of considerations, market timing, the currencies, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
What are some of the things with the tax guidance in mind? What are you thinking about? How are you doing your role?
Absolutely, yes. The FIG regime does give us a sort of greater window of opportunity to restructure the portfolios. But as we've heard, there are, the tax implications for US, UK individuals is complicated enough. Our job as investment managers is certainly not to, to get that, the outcome of those decisions wrong, and certainly to simplify the investment strategies going forward. I suppose one thing to note is whilst they can bring the assets into the UK under the FIG regime and then sell them, they're still subject to US worldwide tax. And so we would want to sort of plan the restructuring of the portfolio over that 4-year period so that we don't suddenly sell everything that is inefficient from a UK perspective or doesn't meet their investment requirements, because we'll give them a very large tax bill in the US in year one. That's certainly not what we want to do. So we certainly want to sort of discuss with them sort of what their long-term goals are, what their tolerance for risk, their capacity to bear losses, and ultimately what their currency of liability is going to be going forward. Yes, they're in the UK now. Are they going to still be in the UK after that 4-year window, or even in up to the 10-year, inheritance tax implications probably come on to later. And so we need to construct a portfolio as efficiently for them as possible. There's also custody arrangements, should they be custodied in the UK, the assets coming over, or still remain offshore. So obviously, as I mentioned, simplicity is really important. So from a US-UK perspective, that just means avoiding the sort of complications of collectives and investing into individual stocks and bonds. That gives us greater scope of being able to manage the portfolio according to their long-term investment objectives. It gives us greater scope to manage gains from both tax jurisdictions, whether it be long or short-term gains from the US or sort of UK 5th of April gains as well. So we can manage that. We can also embed restrictions or in income tilts or whatever it happens to be within their portfolios. And as I mentioned,
it needs something bespoke, doesn't it? And then the investment manager, they're picking direct stocks, direct bonds. It's where you can show your expertise, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's where you can really overlay your investment process, your investment thesis. And yes, as I mentioned before, we can sort of complement that with tactical positioning around ETFs. They're very wide and popular these days, but of course we want to make sure that they are dual qualifying from a US and a UK tax perspective. So it does give us greater scope from an investment management perspective to build a very bespoke portfolio within the new rules of the FIG regime.
Thanks. And Martin, just looking at some of the pension assets, the structures they're coming with, they've got the traditional IRAs, the 401ks. Once they've moved to the UK, what's the implications there? How should they be thinking about those IRAs and 401ks?
I mean, I'm not so worried about that, the IRAs and 401ks, because they're tax deferrals in both the US and UK because of the US-UK income tax treaties. So it's really just when they think about withdrawing it, what is the implications? Probably what I probably want to talk about a bit more is it's very popular these days for Americans to have 529 plans. So these are educational savings plans for usually the kids or the grandparents invest in these plans for the kids. And it's basically tax-free savings as long as the withdrawals are to qualified education for the kids, then the withdrawals are tax-free as well. So it's great savings plans if you're in the US. When they come through to the UK and they've got all this cash saved up in these savings plans, it becomes a bit of an issue because they are not tax-free in the UK. So the FIG window gives you an opportunity for the parents to think about whether they want to keep these plans or not. Particularly if they're going to be here long term, it might not make any sense for them to keep these, because the parents, if they're the contributor to the plan, they're basically contributing to a trust, because all 529 plans are set up under trust. And so HMRC view them as settled or interested trusts. Therefore, they're taxed on the income and gains within the 529 plans as it goes along. So they're not particularly tax inefficient. If grandparents are in the US, it might be a bit better, but there's still rules about withdrawals to the kids in the future when they're in the UK. So generally, during the FIG window, we're looking at things like 529 plans and saying, is it really worth it? If you've got, say, 200,000 or something in there, maybe just withdraw it, you'll have to pay the US tax at that point when you withdraw it, any growth, plus a 10% penalty, but it might be better than the anguish which I've seen clients being in under the 529 plans when they're in the UK.
So when you're going through with the clients looking at relocating, you're looking at all the different structures and assets that they have, and some, like you're saying, the pensions, don't worry about it, that's fine, just accumulating. Others, you're saying actually action on this. It's sort of going through that menu, isn't it?
And also, you need to look at what their long-term plans are. If they're only going to be here for 4 years, then obviously you don't need to do all this restructuring. But if they think they're going to be here longer than 4 years, then yes, make some actions.
And just looking at the trust, so they've got a revocable New York trust purely for US probate. In the UK, this is a bare trust. So what's the implications there? When you're looking at that trust, what are you thinking about in relation to the FIG window?
Yeah, so during that window, you might just want to get a UK advisor to look into the trust to basically make the determination that it is a bare trust, because if there's certain powers, which we've seen in certain trusts, that I mean, I'm not an expert in the law about determining whether this is a bare trust or not, but there are situations where these revocable trusts could actually be substantial trusts from a UK perspective, and that would completely change the planning, because obviously a bare trust, you're taxed on it as if you own the asset, whereas a substantial trust, it's, you know, if it's an offshore trust, then it depends on distributions coming out and matching to income and gains. And there could be a complete mismatch with the US, because these revocable trusts are basically bare trusts in the US as well. So you want to make sure during that window that you've had some sort of advice to say these are actually bare trusts from a tax perspective.
You can't just assume that any trust, it needs a look under the bonnet, basically.
99% of the time they are going to be bare trusts, but I don't want to be the person just determining that. Someone else has to determine that.
You touched on before about the US LLC. It's a small stake, but it's a potential banana skin. What's the implications there on the US LLC, the tiny stake?
The banana skin is complete mismatch in taxation. The US tax it as a transparent entity, so the rental income, which is a real estate entity, so the rental income profits is taxed proportionally to the partners. It's seen as a partnership. Whereas Emily will be taxed in the UK as if when she receives a distribution as a profit, extraction of profits, so it'll be a dividend. And so, you've got whatever the dividend tax rate is, 39 point whatever it is percent, and then you've got the US taxation on the profits at potentially 37%, double taxation. I mean, the UK might allow some sort of deduction on the to get to the profit that's extracted, but it's essentially double taxation. So there is a massive issue there with the LLCs, and if Emily has only 1%, she has no control over what she can do there, really, apart from potentially just sell it. But hopefully she's able to sell it within a 4-year FIG period. But yeah, it's conversations we would have right from the start.
And from the investment management side, Nick, I imagine you run assets under a trust, or there's a variety of structures through which you can work, but you're often appointed into that role, aren't you, by the advisor or the trustee? How do you interact with these different structures that we're talking about?
Well, I mean, obviously we've heard that it's a bit of a minefield from a tax and legal perspective, and we definitely want to be certainly in the room when all these things are being assessed, and also to determine how the structures are then going to be set up going forwards to meet both jurisdictions. But yes, we can certainly manage portfolios if they are in a trust structure or individually. We talked about pensions earlier. We can certainly manage US pensions. If the Harringtons are coming over here, then they might have sort of stranded pensions back in the US where the custody needs to remain. We can certainly do that. So flexibility, as I said, is really important, ensuring that we understand what the longer term objectives from each of the different portfolios is, and therefore managing them accordingly. And also, it's important that if there is going to be a liquidation under the FIG regime of LLC interest or 529 plans and things like that, we need to take that into consideration in our investment planning, thinking about cash flow and things like that, distribution requirements later on down the line. If when Caleb and Sophie sort of go to university or whatever it happens to be, that longer term investment planning is really essential to make all the changes in the structures now so that they are set up correctly, so for future-proofing investment strategies later on.
Because having oversight over a personal account, trust, pension helps you knit an investment thesis together. Otherwise, you could be invested in the same. You could have unintended consequences, couldn't you?
Absolutely, and more often not, they might have their US assets managed by different managers, different custodians, all sorts here, there, and everywhere. Consolidation is quite a useful sort of decision, talking point to have, because then it means we can center the ground and really know what each pot is going to be doing, what the investment objectives for each are, and sort of manage the portfolios effectively from there.
Thanks. And Martin, just coming to you on estate planning. So as we know, the Harringtons are US domiciled, but potentially long-term UK residents. What would the implications be for inheritance tax, and what are the timings that come into play if they're going to become deemed domiciled in the UK?
Yes, we've moved out of a regime whereby we look at domicile in terms of inheritance tax. We're now into a regime of long-term residence. So the Harringtons, when they moved to the UK, they were probably non-domicile, and they were, the old regime pre-2025 was 15 out of the last 20 years residents, you become deemed domiciled. There was also an overriding general law domicile rule as well. But now it's not about domicile at all, it's about how many years you've been resident. So they will not become subject to worldwide inheritance tax until 10 over the last 20 years. So 10 years, 2036 for them. And so there's a bit of planning to be done before then. Now, typically under the old rules, we used to suggest if you've got a bunch of offshore assets, stick it into an excluded property trust, and you'll be protected before you become deemed domicile. Stick it in there, and then those assets are protected from inheritance tax. That all changed, so people have set these trusts up now, having to, the trusts are having to pay inheritance tax every 10 years. But there's an exception for Americans, basically. There is a very sort of valuable section of the US-UK Estate Tax Treaty, Article 5, which basically says as long as you were US domicile when you set up the trust and not a UK citizen, then the trust is basically protected for life from inheritance tax. And it's not just UK offshore assets, it can include UK assets as well, as long as it's not real estate or business assets. So there's this opportunity now that we're seeing that advisors are starting to think about and advise Americans on that, look, assets you may have set up before, trust structures you may have set up before might actually be protected already, but new structures might also be protected because the treaty has not changed, and it doesn't seem like the government seem to be interested in changing it. So there's a massive opportunity there for Americans coming to the UK to use offshore trust structures.
What are the key planning points for someone who is working with a family such as this? What are some of the things that you're tabling from an estate planning perspective?
Get the planning done as soon as possible, before domicile becomes a question mark, and before you get UK citizenship.
Yeah.
Probably get a lawyer, get an investment advisor, get a tax accountant.
And what about just moving on to also other objectives? Many Americans are interested in charitable planning. I mean, Nick, with some of the clients you work with, do you see them getting engaged in philanthropy and setting aside assets for charitable purpose?
Yes, absolutely. As part of the discussions about their long-term investment strategy, their planning, etc. It's quite frequent that sort of charitable giving or philanthropy is perhaps a sort of sometimes a forgotten sort of conversation to have, and actually it's quite a very personal and emotive sort of area. And if you were building relationships with clients, it's a very useful sort of talking point to have. It really taps into sort of what their understanding is of what they want to do with their their future wealth going forward. I mean, obviously there are tax benefits of charitable giving and things like that, but and Martin can point those out. But from an investment point of view, we want to determine, are these one-off gifts or donations to charities, or is there a longer-term requirement for an ongoing distribution to various charities of your choice? And so that really does sort of feature into the sort of longer-term investment strategy about whether or not you can make sustainable sort of endowment type sort of distributions from your portfolio and effectively, and not sort of jeopardize any other part of your investment planning structures, etc. So that's really important. And also from a family perspective, and I suppose in the case of the Harringtons it's a little bit early, but we also see that other families where they've got the next generation coming through and perhaps going to inherit sort of a substantial part of wealth, either via a trust or whatever, then it is charitable foundations or that sort of talking point about gifting to charities is a useful way of bringing the next generation into the investment strategy thinking of the overall family. And they can also sort of embed their own sort of views on ESG and things like that within the investment structure. They would have conversations with us. They may even be a trustee of the charitable foundation themselves. So those sort of things are really, really important and quite useful.
Thanks. And Martin, so just on the tax efficiency side, how can US, UK couples such as this benefit from the regime that's there?
I mean, I imagine a couple like this, they're not gifting hefty amounts, but the main thing is you come into the UK, are you going to get relief in the UK if you're still contributing to your US charities? The answer to that is no. So how can you change that? Making donations to UK charities helps. Making donations to US charities might actually, well, I mean, hefty donations might be an issue because if they're US charitable trusts, are you making a settlement into an offshore trust? So we do have these conversations, but mainly it's when it becomes hefty amounts that we need to start thinking about, should you be contributing to a donor advised fund type thing arrangement so that you can get potentially dual qualified donor advised funds where donations can be tax efficient from a US and UK perspective. And then you get the occasional philanthropist that wants to set their own foundation up. And then that obviously needs involvement with the law firms to set this up in an efficient way that's dual qualified as well. But yeah, just for the family like this, it's mainly start thinking about what's more tax efficient, maybe a UK charity. But then sometimes they still want to donate to the local church back in the US or whatever. So, it might not be tax efficient, but if it's small amounts, that's fine.
Do they look at this kind of tax planning year on year? So when they're doing their annual returns, both for the US and UK, when does it come to light? Like when they're making donations to things and looking at deductions?
I mean, typically when we're preparing a tax return, we ask for all this information, but and we always ask the question about are they interested in dual qualified charity advice? If it's small amounts of money, it's generally not a big issue. But usually the philanthropists, it's straight away when we initially meet them, it's one of the top of their agenda items is I'm donating a lot to charity. What can I do to make it tax efficient?
And you touched on before, Nick, particular structures working well for families. I mean, Martin mentioned the DAF. Do you see this even within the philanthropic scene, a range of structures that you're able to work with?
Yes, absolutely, and they are very efficient from a US UK perspective, and also we know that the Harringtons in this case certainly perhaps don't have a huge amount of money that they're going to be gifting to charity year in, year out. So there are various ways you can do that within the DAF umbrella, because you can simply have an account or for a cash donation, or you can just transfer assets into the DAF yourself, and then they would be distributed out. So it's a very tax efficient perspective. So if there are notwithstanding the FIG regime, if you've got assets that have got quite a lot of unrealized gains with them or they're illiquid, then sometimes these DAF umbrella organizations can take in those assets as a charitable donation, and that sort of kind of solves your problem from that perspective. Gives us less of a headache if we're trying to extricate ourselves from illiquid assets and certainly things like that. So yes, there are sort of lots of different permutations that you can use within these very efficient structures. And then you can also have that continuing conversation with clients about how they want to sort of continue that sort of kind of charitable giving within their investment planning in the years ahead.
Just for some sort of key takeaways as we bring this conversation to a close, Nick, if you were meeting or having a video call with the Harringtons tomorrow who are advising in a couple of months' time, what are some of the things you'd focus on? What would your top questions be that you'd want to discuss with them?
Well, absolutely. Well, first of all, I'd be delighted to have the conversation with the Harringtons, although, perhaps, 2 months before they arrive in the UK, even with the FIG regime, it's not a lot of time. But that FIG regime does give us greater scope to sort of plan even after the event. But certainly, I think there's no time like the present. There are certain things I would want to discuss with them at that initial call. Certainly, do a complete portfolio audit. Find out where their accounts are, what sort of investments they have in them, the sort of the pension assets, things like that. Work out what sort of funds or collectives, etc., are just not going to be viable in the UK, and certainly sort of assess that sort of overall sort of
mapping out
exactly right. And then we would want to work out sort of, are they intending to be in the UK longer term? Are there certain things that we might want to consider for their potential next move? We want to make sure that the portfolio that we construct during the FIG regime is future-proofed. The UK may not be their last destination. So we want to make sure that efficiency, that simplicity is across all of their portfolio structures, and then also work out what their sort of ultimate goals are when they move. We need to be mindful of that, the fact that their current structures and assets, the way they're managed in the US, we know that Daniel is moving over to the UK to have a bit of a calmer period. Is that going to fundamentally change his investment objectives when the family moves over? That sort of thing we need to consider. We can't just simply mirror image what's going on from one jurisdiction to the other. We need to sort of definitely sort of plan something out before they arrive. But I would also certainly want to ensure that they've got suitable tax advisors in place, legal advisors in place, wealth advisors, particularly for the pensions on both sides of the pond, if you like. And it's essential that we as investment managers work side by side with the likes of Martin. Get the team together. There's no, there's no earlier time to do it than sort of right away, sort of kind of thing. So that's really important.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay. Martin, what would your key points be to table with the Harringtons?
Exactly what Nick just said. Basically, get the right advisors in place, legal, tax, and financial advisors, and basically get a team together to go through what that 4-year period is going to look like. Are they going to be here longer than that period? If so, get some proper advice and get everything sorted out basically during that period, because it's a valuable opportunity for them. And if they miss it, it could be expensive.
Thank you. Well, gentlemen, great to talk to you today, and we look forward to sharing this case study.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.